Under the revised will, executed March 4th, 2022, the entirety of the estate, 47 Fairview Drive, the investment accounts totaling $340,000 and all personal effects, passes to Renata Kowalski-Harman. Me, Celeste Hargrove, does not appear as a beneficiary. Arthur Beale read, his eyes moving across the pages in front of him with the measured attention of a man whose job was to deliver other people's decisions. Not question them. The conference room at Beale & Associates smelled like fresh coffee and the particular recycled air of a building constructed in the 1990s. The time was 9:03 in the morning on May 29th, 2023. 12 days had passed since my father died. The light coming through the east-facing windows had that specific brightness of late May, the kind that makes everything slightly overexposed, that bleaches the already pale carpet towards something close to white. 5 chairs surrounded the conference table. 4 of us were sitting. The 5th, at the far end, would have held my father. Instead, it held only the outline of where a person should have been. I had arrived at 8:52 that morning. I had placed a manila folder on the conference table while the room was still empty. The kind of folder you buy in any office supply store in a pack of 10, standard weight. Maybe a 1/4 inch thick when closed. It contained 9 pages. Nobody who walked into that room asked what was inside it. Paralegal. The word did the work for me. Women who worked in law firms carried folders to meetings. This one looked like every other folder a professional woman might carry. And so nobody saw it as anything except what it appeared to be. I had been counting on that exact invisibility since the moment I left my apartment that morning. Renata sat directly across from me, wearing a navy blazer over a white blouse. Her hair freshly set in the kind of blowout that cost $80 and lasts exactly 1 week if the weather cooperates. Her posture was squared, her shoulders back, the kind of composed you cultivate when you have already won and all that remains is paperwork. To her left, an attorney named Clifford from a firm in Cincinnati, hired specifically for this reading, arrived specifically to witness what he believed would be a formality. His legal pad was positioned at the angle of preparation. His pen had not moved. To my right, Luz Reyes sat with her notebook open, her jaw working slightly the way it did when she was calculating something. Luz had tried, for weeks after my father's death, to convince me to negotiate first, to save money on litigation, to settle this quietly before the full machinery of law got involved. She had asked me in her office 2 weeks earlier if I was certain I wanted to pursue this. I had said yes. She had asked why. I had taken her hand and brought her to my apartment, to the fireproof box under my bed, and opened it without speaking. She had seen the 9 pages. She had understood. The house, as stated, passes entirely to Ms. Kowalski-Harman. Beale continued, turning to the next page. He was meticulous. The kind of attorney who reads every clause, who does not abbreviate, who treats the words on the page as the authority they actually are. The primary investment accounts. I'll need to reference the current valuations. But the total, as of the March 4th revision, was approximately $340,000. Those accounts transfer via named beneficiary designation to Ms. Kowalski-Harman, personal effects, including items in the safe deposit box. Go to Ms. Kowalski-Harman, The only remaining provisions are technical powers of attorney, executor appointment, estate and income tax directives. In summary, the estate of Theodore Harmon, deceased May 17th, 2023, passes in its entirety to Renata Kowalski Harmon. There are no other named beneficiaries. He set the pages down. The reading had taken less than 5 minutes. The message was complete and unambiguous. I watched the corners of Renata's mouth settle into something that was not quite a smile, but was meant to approximate one. She had what she wanted: the house, the money, the final revision that erased the previous version where I had been named as the primary beneficiary. 53% of everything that was left of my father's life. Translated into dollars and real estate. $180,000. 47 Fairview Drive in Gahanna, Ohio. The only home I had ever known. The only material proof that my father, at some point, had decided I was worth including. I am 41 years old. I work as a paralegal at Meridian Estate Partners in Columbus. My salary is $51,200 per year. Enough to pay my rent and my student loans and to fund my own life, but not enough to absorb the loss of $180,000 without material consequence. I am organized by training and by temperament. I do not lose documents. I do not forget dates. I file things in the order they should be filed. And I wait. My mother told me when I was 18 and leaving for college that I should keep records. She said it across the kitchen table on a Tuesday evening while she was wiping down the granite counter with a cloth. You can love someone and still protect yourself from them. Keep records. They will matter someday. I did not ask her what records, or from whom, or what scenario she was preparing me for. I was 18. I was angry at my father for things that were not her job to repair. I simply filed the instruction away the same way I file legal procedure. Without drama. Without a specific threat in mind. It lived in the back of my consciousness for 23 years, waiting for the day I would need it. That day had not seemed urgent until March 4th, 2022. It was February 2022 when I first said something to my father about the accounts. We were on the phone. I was calling him the way I called him every week, on Sunday evenings. The obligation I had inherited from my childhood when every other weekend visits meant I had to earn his attention by being useful. I told him, calmly and without accusation, that I had noticed some account activity that concerned me. I told him I thought Renata might be drawing from his checking account without discussion. I was careful with my words. I was not accusing. I was simply reporting a pattern I had observed in the statements he had forwarded to me as a courtesy, the way he forwarded many things: documents, tax forms, quarterly updates, always in the tone of someone completing an obligation. He said he would look into it. He did not sound alarmed. I noted the tone. I did not mention it again. 11 days later, on March 4th, 2022, a revised will was executed at Beale & Associates. I did not know this yet. It would take me 2 years to discover it. But I had already moved, on March 21st, 2022, to secure my evidence. I called my father 3 weeks after the account conversation and asked him directly and without preamble whether his documents were still the way he wanted them to be. The will and everything, I said, are those still the same as before? He said yes. He said it without hesitation. He said it without a pause. I wrote the date in the margin of my planner that evening, March 21st. Below it, I wrote 2 words. He lied. Not in anger, not as an accusation, just as a note. The way I note facts. The folder on the table in front of Arthur Beale was manila. Inside it were 9 pages of my father's original will. Dated August 14th, 2019, signed by him in front of 2 witnesses, and notarized, certified as true and accurate, by Rosa Delgado, a notary public working the counter at the UPS store on Cleveland Avenue in Gahanna, Ohio. For a fee of $40 on September 21st, 2020. I had photographed the original during a 3-day house-sitting visit in September 2020, while my father and Renata were vacationing in Myrtle Beach. I had photographed all 9 pages, one by one, in the afternoon light of his kitchen, standing in that particular spot where the sun came in between 2 and 3 in the afternoon at an angle I had known since I was 8 years old. I had taken the images to the UPS store the following Monday. I had paid Rosa Delgado $40. I had returned to my apartment and placed the notarized copy in a fireproof box and stored it under my bed. I had told no one. There was nothing yet to tell. Beale adjusted his glasses. He was looking at Renata, waiting for her to indicate satisfaction with the reading. Clifford had already begun gathering his own notes. The morning light shifted slightly, the angle of the sun changing as it did every 40 seconds or so. The room brightening and dimming in that particular way only late May light could manage. I placed my hands on the manila folder. Then I opened it. I removed the first page of the notarized copy of my father's 2019 will. The paper was standard legal weight. The notary stamp was in the bottom right corner, clean and clear. I did not speak. I placed it on the table directly in front of Arthur Beale. Face up so he could read the document number, the date, the opening language of the will. Then I removed the second page. I placed it next to the first, then the third. My hands did not shake. My breathing did not change. I placed each page deliberately, in sequence, watching Arthur Beale's face as he began to understand what he was looking at. The revised will sat to his left. Only 5 pages. The one he had just finished reading. The one that erased me. The original was growing on his right. Page after page, accumulating, the document getting thicker as it spread across the table. 8 pages, 9 pages. I placed my hands back in my lap. I waited until all 9 were face down in front of him before I opened my mouth. "The document in front of you," I said, "is a notarized copy of a will executed August 14th, 2019, signed by Theodore Harmon in the presence of 2 witnesses. It names me as primary beneficiary of 53% of the estate, with the house passing to my personal estate and the investment accounts divided between his surviving spouse and myself." I photographed the original on September 14th, 2020, while house-sitting at his residence. I had the images notarized on September 21st, 2020, by a notary public registered in the state of Ohio. I have the notarization date. I have the notary commission number. I have all 9 pages, certified as true and accurate copies. I placed my hands back on the table. I waited. Renata's face did not change immediately. "That was the remarkable thing." She continued to sit with her shoulders squared, her posture intact, for maybe 3 full seconds after the 9th page landed on the table. Then something shifted. The composure did not crack. She was too careful for that. But it flickered. Just once. Just long enough for me to see that she had not anticipated this moment. She had not believed it was possible. Luz had set down her pen. Her notebook was forgotten. She was watching Arthur Beale examine the first page, then the second, her eyes tracking his as he began to read the notarization language. The official seal, the signature block. "This is impossible," Renata said. Her voice was still controlled, but there was something underneath it now. Not panic, she was too contained for panic, but the particular note of someone who had just realized that their understanding of a situation was fundamentally incomplete. Arthur Beale set down the revised will. He picked up the first page of the copy, the gesture alone, the revised document lowered, the older one raised, told the entire room what his next move would be. He adjusted his glasses. The light from the table lamp was not quite enough. He excused himself and came back 3 minutes later with a second lamp from his office. The kind with the bright bulb they use for reading fine print. That was when I knew I had already won. The visits began at 2 p.m. on Saturday. My mother would drop me at the curb of 47 Fairview Drive in her station wagon, and I would stand on the sidewalk and wait for my father to open the door. He knew I was coming. We had the same schedule, every other weekend, for 11 years. But he did not come to the curb to meet me. I had to come to the door. I had to wait for him to open it, to let him establish that the visit was officially beginning. I was 8 years old when my parents divorced in 1990. By the time I was 10, I could read the quality of his welcome in the angle of his body before he even spoke, before his hand was on the doorframe, before his mouth shaped whatever greeting he had prepared. Some Saturdays, he was present in the way I wanted. Other Saturdays, he was already somewhere else. His mind already returned to whatever he had been doing before I arrived. On those Saturdays, I became very organized. I learned, through the repetition of 24 months of visits, that I could shift his attention by being useful. If the dishes from his Friday night dinner were still in the sink, and I washed them without being asked, he noticed. He would appear in the kitchen doorway 10 minutes later and say, "I was going to get to those," which meant thank you in his particular language. If I set the table for Sunday morning pancakes before he suggested breakfast, if I found the good plates in the cabinet, the ones he used for company, and arranged them with forks and napkins without being told, he would say, "You're thoughtful," in a tone that suggested mild surprise, as if I had exceeded his expectations, rather than simply arrived at the minimum requirement of being present in someone else's home. One Saturday in December, when I was 13, I was reading in the living room while he read the newspaper. I made coffee, not for him. I was 13, and I did not make coffee at 13 in someone else's house without permission. I made it because the coffee maker in the kitchen made noise, and I had learned that if I kept the house running smoothly, if small domestic tasks completed themselves without requiring his attention or energy, he was happier, quieter, less likely to drift away into irritation about the inconvenience of my visit. I had made the coffee and left it on the counter. 20 minutes later, he appeared in the kitchen and said, "Did you make this?" I said yes. He said, "That was thoughtful of you," and poured himself a cup and returned to his newspaper. I stood in the kitchen alone and understood, in the way you understand things as a child, that I had succeeded. I had done something right. What I did not understand until much later was that the pleasure I felt at his mild approval was because I had made myself useful in a way that required nothing from him. That I had managed to be present in his house without being a problem. That was what he was praising. Not my thoughtfulness about coffee, but my general lack of burden. If I managed the rest of the afternoon, if I proposed activities that required minimal conversation, or if I sat in the living room while he watched football and stayed quiet enough to be ignorable. Asking only the questions that led him to talk about his work, rather than questions that would require him to actually know something about mine. The visit went smoothly. Smoothly meant he was not irritable when my mother picked me up at 6 p.m. Smoothly meant we had not had a moment of awkward silence that lasted longer than a few seconds. Smoothly meant I had done the visit correctly, had managed the mechanics of his fathering in the way he apparently needed. It managed. My father was a civil engineer. He had designed portions of highway infrastructure across Ohio and southern Indiana. He spoke about his work with a precision he rarely applied to anything else in his life. He could describe the structural integrity of a bridge, the load calculations, the environmental impact assessments, for 45 minutes without pause, without ever once lifting his eyes to check whether I was still interested or whether I had drifted away entirely into my own thoughts. I sat across from him during those monologues. At the kitchen table, in the basement while he was doing woodworking, in the car driving somewhere he had suggested we go, and felt the peculiar relief of invisibility. As long as he was talking about work, he was not asking me questions that required him to actually know me. As long as I was listening, I was succeeding at the visit. I was being useful. This was the arithmetic of it. My presence plus my complete compliance plus my competent invisibility equaled his tolerable distance. The house itself was always cool, in the way houses are cool when they are kept at a careful temperature by someone who lives alone and does not have anyone else's comfort to consider. 47 Fairview Drive was a 1970s split level with oak paneling in the basement, and a kitchen that opened onto a living room with excellent light in the afternoon, particularly on clear days in fall. The furniture was tan couch, tan carpeting, the kind of neutral palette that comes from not caring whether your environment matches your life. There were prints on the walls of lighthouses and sailing ships that I do not remember him ever discussing, that I do not think he had chosen specifically, that looked like the kind of art you inherit with a house or purchase because a salesperson told you it would work with the rest of the room. The kitchen had a window over the sink that looked out onto a backyard, with grass kept short by a man with a lawn service contract. It was not an unhappy house exactly. It was an unfinished house. A man living in the intervals between his obligations. He was not unkind. That is the particular and specific torture of it. He was not unkind. He was simply not quite present enough to be reliably loved by. He was not quite absent enough to be escaped from. He was precisely, carefully placed in that middle distance where you cannot stop trying to reach him, but you also cannot quite succeed. He loved me the way some people love tasks they do not particularly enjoy, but have committed to completing responsibly, with competence, with the expectation of recognition for completion. The praise came when I succeeded at something. You're organized. You're responsible. You're good at managing situations. What never came was, I missed you. I thought about you this week. What never came was, tell me what you've been thinking about. Tell me what scares you. What never came was the simple, unremarkable presence of someone wanting to know me rather than wanting me to function in a way that required nothing difficult from him. At 19, I was sitting across from him at a Perkins restaurant on East Broad Street, the one that was always full of families on Saturday nights. The vinyl of the booth was that particular orange-brown that restaurants used in the 1980s and 1990s, worn smooth by thousands of people shifting their weight against it. The restaurant smelled like fried food and coffee, and the particular staleness of a place that had been open since lunch. He had ordered a patty melt with waffle fries. I had ordered a salad I did not want. The kind of choice a young woman makes when she is still trying to demonstrate to her father that she will not require anything of him, that she can nourish herself modestly and independently, and never ask him to provide. Between bites of his sandwich, he explained to me, calmly, and as if it was a solution he had carefully considered over weeks, that he was not really a phone person, and that I should just stop by whenever, if I wanted to see him. Stop by whenever. As if my time, my logistics, my schedule, my need to coordinate a visit with another human being who had a life outside his house, was somehow negotiable, but his availability was not. As if love was something that flowed in one direction, from the person with less power to the person with more, and as if he was generously giving me permission to reduce the frequency of my attempts. I understood. In that moment in the booth with the orange-brown vinyl, with his coffee growing cold next to his plate, what he was actually saying beneath what he was saying. I understood that the previous 11 years of carefully managing his silences, of arriving early and leaving precisely on time, of making myself useful and undemanding and small, had been preparation for my accepting an even less reliable arrangement. He was tired, not of me specifically. I do not think it was personal enough for that. He was tired of the schedule itself. He wanted me to come around when it was convenient for him, which meant I would come around rarely, because convenient for him meant times when he had no other obligations, when no other demands on his time had materialized, which were becoming less and less frequent as he moved through his life and accumulated his own commitments to his own preferences. I did not argue. I ate my salad one leaf at a time. I let him believe that I had understood his proposal as a gesture of trust, as a generous loosening of his constraints, when what it actually was a restructuring of abandonment into something that looked like my choice. For the next 22 years, I would occasionally stop by 47 Fairview Drive. I would call him every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. The obligation I had somehow inherited. And he would take my call in the tone of someone accepting a delivery they had not ordered, but could not refuse. He praised my job at the law firm. He asked generic questions about my apartment. He never once asked me why I kept calling, why I kept visiting, why I had not yet decided, at some point between 19 and 41, that I was not worth this much translation work, this much effort to connect with someone who had already communicated quite clearly that connection would only go so far. My mother told me, the week before I left for college, to keep records. I was 18. We were standing in her kitchen, and she was wiping down the granite counter with a cloth. Her movements precise and deliberate, the way everything about her was precise. "You can love someone," she said, without looking up from the counter, "and still protect yourself from them. Keep records. They will matter someday." She did not expand on this. She did not specify what kind of records, or from whom I would need protection, or what scenario she was imagining that would require my documentation. She simply stated it as fact and returned to her work. I filed it away the same way I filed everything in those years, without drama, without a specific threat in mind, without knowing that I was being given a tool and a permission that I would not actually need for 23 years. But I kept it, the instruction, the permission. It lived in the back of my consciousness like a key is in your pocket, but that you do not take out and examine regularly. You know it is there. You know what it is for. You simply do not know when you will need to use it. I became a paralegal. I learned to file documents in the precise order they should be filed, chronologically, alphabetically, by statute, or by relevance. I learned to verify signatures against known samples, to check dates against court calendars, to identify the particular language that separates a preliminary agreement from a binding one, a casual promise from a legal commitment. I learned to read what people wrote when they were making a promise they intended to keep, and what they wrote when they were constructing a trap door into an out. And I waited, not consciously. I was not sitting in my apartment thinking, someday I will need the original of my father's will. I was simply, by training and by temperament, recording what was happening the way a woman records everything when she has been told by her own mother that records will matter. I kept the bank statements my father forwarded to me every quarter, filed them in folders I labeled by year, and maintained alphabetically. I noted the dates of our conversations in the margins of my planner, not out of suspicion, not out of anger, but simply because that was what I did. I recorded things. I kept track. When he said yes to something, a holiday dinner, a promise to help me move, a conversation we would have when timing was better, and then explained weeks later that circumstances had changed. I made a note of it. Not to use against him, and not to prove anything. Simply to remember, to not have to re-explain myself or ask the same question twice. I learned, through this recording, what my father meant when he said yes, but only if it was convenient, yes, but something would probably come up, yes, in the way some people said yes to be kind, rather than yes, because they meant it. I was not collecting evidence of wrongdoing. I was simply observing the way a woman observes when she has been trained to observe, and I was keeping track of the small inconsistencies between what was promised and what was delivered, the way you keep track of anything that might matter later. My mother had told me at 18 that records would matter someday. I did not know what that would look like. I did not know that someday would mean a revised will executed 3 years after his daughter expressed concerns about account access. I did not know that my habit of filing, my temperament for detail, my refusal to forget what was said to me, all of it was preparation for a moment I could not yet imagine. But I kept the records anyway, the way you keep a key in your pocket, even though you do not know what lock you will need it for. My father met Renata Kowalski at a home goods trade expo in Columbus in April 2018. She owned a boutique called Kowalski Home Goods in a strip mall in Gahanna, about 20 minutes from his house. And she had rented a booth to display her line of hand-painted dishware and linens. The story he told me later was simple. He wandered past, stopped at the display, picked up a set of napkins with a pattern of blue birds, and apparently that was enough. She was 48 years old. She had never been married. She had built her business from nothing. She knew exactly what she wanted, and what she wanted, apparently, was my father. By December of that year, 8 months later, she was living at 47 Fairview Drive full-time. She had moved in her furniture, pieces that were more substantial, more intentional than what my father had, and the house had begun to look occupied in a way it had not looked for years. The guest room closet, where I had hung my coat during visits, was now full of her clothes. The kitchen had a new label in the refrigerator with her name. The living room furniture had been rearranged according to her vision. She had opinions about which of my father's existing plates were worth keeping and which should be replaced with her own. Now, I did not know the relationship had progressed this far until she was already there. Woven into the house's rhythm, the way you weave a pattern into fabric. I called him in early January, the way I called every Sunday evening, and he mentioned, casually, as if it was something I already knew, that Renata had moved in. I remember the exact moment of that phone call. I was in my apartment, standing at my own kitchen counter, and I felt something settle in my chest. Not quite fear, but an absence of something I had taken for granted. My father had always been mine to manage. My father had always been the problem I was solving by my presence, my competence, my willingness to exist in his house without requiring anything from him. Now, there was someone else solving the problem of his life. The first time I came to dinner while she was there, it was a Sunday in February 2019. My father had called me and invited me, which was not unusual, but the invitation carried a note I had not heard in a long time, a kind of readiness, as if he had thought about the logistics in advance and was prepared for me to say yes. He said Renata wanted to meet me properly. He said she had made something special. I drove to 47 Fairview Drive at 5:15 in the evening in a state I now recognize as anxiety. Though I did not name it that then. I was simply a daughter going to dinner at her father's house. I did nothing unusual to prepare. I simply arrived. Renata answered the door. She was dressed in a cream-coloured linen blouse and dark jeans, the kind of groomed presentation that made clear this dinner was an introduction. A moment being staged. Her hair was blown out. She was wearing makeup in the careful way some women wear makeup, not as adornment, but as a signal that she was taking this meeting seriously. She smiled at me with an expression I could not quite read, and she pulled me into a hug that felt both warm and performed. As if she was demonstrating how a woman genuinely happy to meet her boyfriend's daughter would behave. I did not know what he had told her about me. I did not know how you described a daughter to a new partner when the daughter's presence in your life had been managed through careful limitation for 30 years. But I smiled back and said hello, and I followed her into the house, which smelled different now. It smelled like her products. Something citrus, something floral. The particular smell of a woman who used quality soaps and who kept her environment clean in an active, maintained way, rather than the passive cleanliness of my father's house, which had simply been empty of disorder. In the kitchen, my father was setting the table. Usually I set the table. Usually I moved through his house doing the small tasks that made the visit feel earned, as if my presence there was not simply obligatory, but actually useful. Renata had made beet soup. The colour was a deep, dark red, almost purple, and the kitchen was filled with the smell of vinegar and earth, the particular richness of beets cooked down to concentrate their flavour into something intense and refined. She had paired it with rye bread that she told me she had made herself, and a salad dressed in a quality vinaigrette that carried the taste of good olive oil and wine vinegar. It was thoughtful. It was also a display. Everything about Renata, I would come to understand, was a display, a carefully managed presentation of a woman who was cultured, interesting, intentional, a woman who had a life before my father, and who had chosen to include him in it. We sat at the table and Renata began asking me questions. They came with the appearance of genuine interest. She asked how I liked my job at Meridian Estate Partners, and when I told her I was a paralegal, she asked, "Do you think you'll move into a full attorney role eventually?" I said I was not sure. She nodded with what seemed like disappointment, and then she asked, "What does a paralegal make? I'm just curious about different professions." I told her my salary was $51,200 per year. She made a small sound of acknowledgement, not approval, just acknowledgement. And then, "Do you own your apartment, or do you rent?" I had rented the same 2-bedroom in the Short North neighbourhood of Columbus for 6 years. It was what a woman of my income could afford. She continued, "Has your father mentioned anything about real estate?" "I've been encouraging him to look at rental properties. You could build wealth that way. At your age, you're already behind if you don't own." At your age, I was 37. There it was, embedded in what sounded like concern, an inventory. She was not asking out of interest in me. She was asking to establish where I stood financially. How much of my father's resources were at risk of flowing toward me? Whether I was the kind of daughter who expected support, or the kind who could be rendered irrelevant through her own independence. I understood this without understanding it. I simply answered her questions carefully, as if I was testifying in court. I told her I had not thought much about real estate. I told her my job was stable. I told her things designed to make me sound self-sufficient, self-contained, not a threat to whatever arrangement she was building with my father. Halfway through the meal, Renata set down her spoon and looked at me directly. Something shifted in her expression, a kind of assessment complete in itself. She said, "Teddy talks about you. He says you're very organized." The pause before organized carried weight I could not yet articulate. It was not a compliment. It was a category. It was the kind of word you use when you want to describe someone without saying what you actually think of them. Organized, efficient, controlled, the opposite of spontaneous, of warm, of the kind of presence that brings joy to a room simply by existing. It was the kind of word you use to describe a problem that has been managed but not solved. I felt something in my chest tighten, like a belt being cinched. but I filed the pause away without examining it. I did not yet have cause. I simply made a note of it the way I made notes of many things in my life. Small inconsistencies, behavioral shifts, the particular ways people revealed their actual opinions through word choice and timing. It was a habit from my work. It was a habit from my life. I nodded and said thank you, and I meant it, because I genuinely believed that being organized was something to be proud of. It had kept me alive. It had made me necessary. After we finished eating, Renata stood and began clearing the dishes. She did this methodically, efficiently, the way someone clears dishes who has been managing her own home for a long time and does not expect help. My father did not move. I stood as well, the way my body knew how to move in this house. But Renata waved me back to my seat with a gesture that was not quite rude, but was clearly a boundary. "You're a guest," she said, and it was the first time I heard the edge in her voice, clear and unambiguous. The first time I understood, without having to think very hard, that she had already decided how this arrangement would work. I was a guest in my father's house now. I was no longer the woman who set the table and washed the dishes and managed the visit. That role had been replaced. My father waited until Renata had left the room, until we could hear water running in the kitchen, the sound of her moving around the space as if she owned it, which I understood now she effectively did. And then he pulled me aside into the hallway. He put his hand on my arm, and his voice was low, the way it became when he was saying something he needed me to understand and accept without argument. "Renata makes things easier," he said. "She's good at managing the house. She's good at managing things. I think you'll like her." Easier. The word was perfectly chosen. He meant that Renata did not require anything of him. She did not ask him to be present in ways that demanded effort. She did not require him to show up for a conversation that was about her needs rather than his comfort. She made things easier by assuming control of the environment, by not needing anything from him except his consent to be managed. And by extension, she freed him from the daughter who had spent 30 years asking, through her presence and her care, for something he was unwilling to give. I nodded. I told him I was happy for him. I meant it in the way you mean things when you are saying them to yourself, as much as to the person in front of you. I meant it because the alternative was to acknowledge that my love had cost him something, that my presence was a burden rather than a gift, that I would be better off invisible to him, and that would require me to stop trying. And I was not yet ready to stop trying. What I did not yet understand was that Renata had already completed her assessment of me and found me manageable. I was organized. I was self-sufficient. I did not challenge her authority. I did not expect much from my father. I was in every way that mattered to her, not a threat. What she could not have understood, because I did not raise my voice and I did not make a scene, was that I was filing everything away. The pause before organized, the inventory of my finances, the way she cleared the dishes without offering me a role, the way my father's relief at her presence felt like a small death of the part of me that had thought my care mattered. In the weeks after that dinner, I began to pay closer attention. I asked my father, in my Sunday calls, how Renata was settling in. He said she was wonderful. He said she had already made improvements to the house. He said she was talking about some ideas for the kitchen, for the landscaping. for how the space could be better utilized. Every time he mentioned her name, there was something in his voice I had never heard before. A kind of ease, a kind of lightness, as if a weight he did not know he was carrying had been lifted. I was happy for him. I was also keeping track, the way a woman keeps track of anything that might matter someday. I was watering the ficus in the front room of 47 Fairview Drive when my father and Renata drove away for Myrtle Beach. It was September 2020, and they would be gone for 5 days. I had offered to house sit, to collect the mail, water the plants, make sure the house did not feel abandoned while they were away. It was the kind of thing I had always done. It was the kind of thing I had learned to do early, in the years after my parents' divorce, when presence could be substituted for presence by ensuring that spaces were maintained, that small emergencies were prevented, that nothing was neglected. My father had accepted my offer with a nod and the words, "That would be helpful," as if I had offered to pick up an additional errand rather than spend 3 days in a house that had never felt entirely like mine. Even though I had spent every other weekend there for the first 18 years of my life, the first day was unremarkable. I collected the mail, which consisted mostly of bills and advertisements and a catalogue for upscale garden furniture. I walked through the rooms and noted what needed attention. The kitchen tile was dusty. The living room could use a vacuuming. The bathroom sink had the kind of hard water stains that required a specific approach. Vinegar and a soft cloth, applied in circles rather than back and forth. The way my mother had taught me when I was young. I did these things. I made the house run. By evening, the spaces were cleaner than they had been when I arrived. The ficus had been watered. The mail had been sorted. The refrigerator had been checked for expired items. I had made myself useful in the way that mattered in this house, through the careful management of small details. On the second day, I slept in my childhood bedroom. The ceiling still had the glow star stickers I had put up at 12 years old. They had faded from their original bright green to a pale, sickly yellow. But they were still there, or clinging to the plaster, as if they had as much right to the space as I did. I lay in bed that morning and looked at them and felt the particular discomfort of returning to a place that had not changed while I had. The bedroom was frozen in time. The same twin bed. The same dresser with porcelain handles. The same small desk where I had done homework while listening to my parents argue through the walls in the 1990s. I had not slept in this room in more than 20 years. I had not needed to. But here I was, spending the night in the ghost of my own childhood, and the stickers were still stuck to the ceiling, waiting for a grown woman to come back and remember being young. It was strange to lie there at 37 years old and see the room as it was, unchanged and patient, as if it had always known I would return. On the third afternoon, the dishwasher made a noise I did not recognize. It was a grinding sound, not quite metal on metal, but close, the sound of something that was supposed to turn smoothly, meeting resistance, encountering something it could not overcome. I was in the kitchen, preparing lunch, when the machine completed its cycle and the noise stopped. But it had registered. It was not right. The sound had been wrong in a way that told me the dishwasher was beginning to fail. My father did not take care of appliances the way some people did. He did not maintain them, did not have them serviced, did not read manuals or learn the particular needs of objects that served him. He simply used them until they broke, and then called someone to repair or replace them. So I decided, in the practical way, I decided things, to find the warranty. If the dishwasher was still covered, he would want to know. I opened the cabinet where my father kept papers. The lower cabinet to the left of the sink, the one I had seen him open 100 times over 30 years. It was organized in a way that suggested organization without truly being organized. Folders and binders and loose papers, filed by a logic only my father understood. I found the homeowner's insurance binder without difficulty. Behind it, in a plain manila sleeve with nothing written on the outside, was a will. I did not consciously decide to open it. My hand simply reached for it and pulled it free from the cabinet. It was not hidden. It was not locked away in a safe or a bank vault. It was simply filed behind the insurance, in the place where a man who trusted things to stay put would leave a document he believed would remain undisturbed. The sleeve was not sealed. Inside were 9 pages. The first page read, "Last Will and Testament of Theodore Harmon," dated August 14th, 2019. My father's signature was on the final page, witnessed by 2 names I did not recognize. People who had been present at the signing, who had seen him make his choices official. I was holding the will that would have mattered if my father had died at any point between August 14th, 2019, and the moment I found it in September 2020. This was the document that would determine what happened to 47 Fairview Drive, to the investment accounts that comprised the rest of his estate, to the material representation of his life's work after he was gone. This was the legal record of how he had intended for the life he built to be distributed when he could no longer be here to distribute it himself. I read it standing up, in the particular afternoon light that comes through the kitchen window between 2 and 3 p.m. When the sun hits the linoleum at an angle I have known since I was 8 years old, the angle of light that marked a specific time of day, a specific season, a specific moment in the slow rotation of the earth, and my place in it. The light is very bright at that hour in September. It washes the room in a yellowish clarity that makes everything look temporally distinct, as if you are seeing the present moment and remembering it simultaneously. I stood in that light and read my father's words, and the words were clear and unambiguous. I was named as the primary beneficiary. I was to receive 53% of the estate, including 47 Fairview Drive, the house where I was standing, the house where I had grown up, the investment accounts, totaling approximately $340,000, were to be divided. 53% to me, totaling approximately $340,000, were to be divided. 53% to me, with the remainder to be held in trust for any future spouse. The remaining assets were to be distributed according to my father's wishes, as expressed in a separate document. This will was dated August 14th, 2019. My father had signed it in the summer of 2019, 11 days before Renata moved into this house full-time. This was the will that existed in the space before her. This was the document that represented what my father had intended when his daughter was still the person closest to him, when her inheritance was not yet a question, when the version of his life that he documented on paper still included I did not sit down. I did not react with any visible emotion. I simply held the pages and understood, very clearly, what I was holding. I understood that this document represented a boundary. The boundary between the life my father had built and whatever life Renata intended to build on top of it. I understood that the gap between this will, the one I was reading, dated more than a year before this moment, and whatever will might be signed in the future would be the gap in which everything would be decided. And I understood, with the clarity that comes from working in estate law, from having seen cases brought by families who swore they had seen a previous will but had no proof, from having watched the law move slowly and expensively against people who had no documentation, I understood that documents could disappear. My phone was already in my hand. I do not remember taking it out of my pocket. I do not remember consciously deciding to photograph the will. But as I stood there in the kitchen light, the sun making it difficult to read the screen, I understood that I needed to have a copy of this, and so I photographed it, all 9 pages. The first page, with the date and my father's name typed across the top, the pages listing the assets and the distributions, the page with his signature and the 2 witness signatures, the final page with the notary's stamp, proof that this will had been executed properly, that it was a valid and binding document. I photographed them all in the kitchen light, the sun making the screen almost impossible to read. But I kept the phone steady, and I made sure each page was clear and legible. I did not rush. I did not panic. I did not feel any particular emotional response beyond a kind of precise clarity. The clarity of someone who has recognized what matters and is taking the necessary steps to protect it. I simply documented. When I finished photographing, I replaced the 9 pages in the manila sleeve. I slid the sleeve back behind the homeowner's insurance binder. I closed the cabinet. The kitchen looked exactly as it had looked before I opened it. Nothing had changed, but I was no longer the same person who had opened it. That evening, I made dinner in my father's kitchen, using ingredients I found in the refrigerator and the pantry. I ate alone at the table where he and Renata ate together. I cleaned up after myself. I washed the dishes by hand, because I was not going to use the dishwasher that was making that grinding noise. I went to sleep in my childhood bedroom under the faded glow star stickers. And I slept without dreams. Or at least, without remembering them. I did not tell anyone what I had found. The following Monday, I took a lunch break from Meridian Estate Partners. I went home, printed the 9 photographs on my personal printer, and then drove to the UPS store on Cleveland Avenue in Gahanna, the strip mall across from the Whole Foods, where I sometimes bought lunch. The woman behind the counter was named Rosa Delgado. She was a notary public. I recognized the stamp on the wall, the certificate of her commission framed next to the register, the particular authority of her position. She looked up when I came in, and she did not recognize me, because I had no reason to know her, and she had no reason to know me. I told her I needed to have some documents notarized. I did not explain what they were or why I had printed photographs of another document, rather than bringing an original. I did not explain the particular circumstances that had led me to this UPS store at this moment. I simply gave her the printed pages I had brought, and I watched while she examined them, compared them to my driver's license, satisfied herself that I was who I claimed to be, that the documents I was asking her to certify as true copies were, to the best of my knowledge and belief, accurate representations of originals. She stamped each page with her notary seal. She signed each page with her name and the date, and her commission number. She entered the information into a log, recording the transaction, by creating an official record of the fact that these documents had been presented to her for notarization. The whole process took maybe 10 minutes. The notarization cost $40. I paid her in cash. I took the folder with the 9 notarized pages, and I drove back to Meridian Estate Partners. I ate the rest of my lunch at my desk, while pretending to work, while actually sitting very still and thinking about what I had just done and what it meant. That evening, I went home to my apartment. I had a fireproof box that I kept under my bed. The kind of box you're supposed to use for important documents. The kind of box that comes with a fire-safe rating and a lock. The kind of box that will survive a fire and keep its contents intact. I placed the notarized copy of my father's will inside the box. I closed it. I turned the key. I placed it back under my bed where it had been, gathering dust, waiting for a reason to be used. I did not tell anyone what I had done, not my mother, who had taught me to keep records, not Luz Reyes, my attorney friend, who would have counseled caution or negotiation or some kind of measured response based on worry or strategy, not my father, not Renata, not anyone. I simply knew what I knew, and I kept it to myself the way a woman keeps a secret when she understands that speaking it aloud will only force her to act on it before she is ready, or before she has all the information she needs. I was a paralegal. I worked with wills and trusts and the machinery of how people's lives were divided up after they died. I had seen the way documents could vanish, a previous version stored in a wrong folder, a copy left behind in a file that was then discarded, an original kept by someone who lost it or destroyed it accidentally or deliberately. I had seen the way a careless copy could be lost or destroyed or explained away as a preliminary draft, as something not meant to be official. I had sat in rooms with families who swore they had seen a previous will, who knew their father or mother had intended something different, who had no proof and therefore no recourse. I had watched the law move slowly and expensively in their favour, or more often against them, because they did not have documentation. They had memory. They had intention. They did not have proof. I was not being paranoid. I was being professional. I was being the person my mother had raised me to be. The person who kept records not out of fear, but out of knowledge. The knowledge that things disappear. The knowledge that intentions are not the same as documents. The knowledge that a man could love his daughter and still, through the simple act of signing a new will, erase that love from the legal record, that intentions could be changed, that documents could be revised, and that the old documents, if they were not preserved, would vanish as if they had never existed. I did not know, in September 2020, that my father would die less than 3 years later, in May 2023. I did not know that Renata would attempt to disinherit me in a revised will signed on March 4th, 2022. 11 days after I called my father and expressed concern about account access. I did not know that I would one day walk into an attorney's office and place this copy on a desk and watch a man's assumptions about the situation shift like sand falling through an hourglass. But I knew the shape of these things. I had seen them before, in files and in cases, and in the particular way that people's lives could be unmade by the absence of documentation. So I had simply done what I knew to do. I had kept records. I had documented. I had preserved. And then I had waited to see if that preparation would matter. The changes began subtly in late 2021. I did not notice them as a pattern at first. I noticed them as individual moments. Small inconsistencies that did not add up to a story yet. Only to a collection of details I filed away the way I filed everything. The first came from a neighbour who forwarded me a group text that Renata had sent to several people on the street. In the message, Renata referred to 47 Fairview Drive as my house. Not Theodore's house, not our house, not the house where Theodore lives. My house. The text was about a landscaping decision, about some trees that were going to be removed to make room for new plantings that Renata had apparently chosen. But the language was unmistakable. She had claimed the house as entirely hers. I did not confront my father about it. I simply noted it. I noted the date, October 28th, 2021. I noted the exact phrasing. I told myself it could have been casual language, the kind of thing people say without thinking carefully about pronouns or possession. But I had spent enough time watching the small ways people revealed their actual beliefs through language. In the documents I reviewed, in the small slips that appeared when someone was no longer carefully managing their presentation, that I did not believe this was casual. She believed the house was hers. That belief was present in the text before she even consciously chose the words. She was not testing the waters with my house. She had already decided. Around the same time, I called my father to ask a question about his estate documents. It was a Sunday evening. I remember this because I called him every Sunday at 7 p.m. The obligation I had inherited, the commitment I had never questioned. The phone rang twice before he picked up. I could hear the television in the background. I asked him plainly whether his will and his other documents were still set up the way they had been when we last discussed them, which had been several years earlier. Are your documents still the way you left them? I was choosing my language carefully, as if I was deposing a witness. I was giving him a very specific opening to tell me the truth, a way to say, actually, we made some changes, without it being shocking. He paused. Not for a long time, but long enough that I noticed. Long enough that I understood something was wrong. He said, yet why? His voice had a quality I had learned to recognize in other people's voices, a kind of defensive preemptiveness, as if he was preparing to argue before I had accused him of anything. As if he had already rehearsed his answer. I said I had just wanted to check. I said no particular reason. I let him off the hook because I was not yet ready to press. I was still hoping to be wrong. I was still hoping that his pause meant something innocent, something explainable, something that was not what I was beginning to suspect. But I had worked in estate law long enough to know what a pause in that conversation usually meant. A pause usually meant that the person on the other end was making a decision about what to tell me. A pause usually meant that the truth and the lie were both available options, and they were choosing between them. I had been in rooms with families who told me, years after a will was signed, that they had known something was wrong. They had sensed it. They had heard it in the voice of the person they were asking. and they had let it pass because they were not ready to hear the answer. In late 2021, another neighbour, a woman named Jennifer, who lived 3 houses down on Fairview Drive, mentioned to me, casually, in the way neighbours mention things that they assume are not important, that she had seen a car in my father's driveway on a Tuesday afternoon in the spring. The car belonged to someone she did not recognise, a woman in professional dress who had gone into the house and stayed for about 45 minutes. Jennifer assumed it was a contractor or a real estate agent. She mentioned it only because the car had a law firm decal on the back window. Beale and Associates. The name struck something in me, a kind of recognition that came before conscious thought. I felt something shift in my chest at the name. Beale and Associates was an estate planning firm. I knew this because I worked in estate law, because I'd seen their name on documents, because I knew what it meant when an attorney, particularly an estate attorney, visited someone's house. An attorney does not visit a house to review existing documents. An attorney visits a house to create new ones, to draft something, to have it witnessed properly, to have it signed in a particular way that would make it difficult to challenge later. To make sure that when the person died, the documents would be indisputable, the signatures verified, the intention impossible to contest. I did not ask Jennifer which Tuesday. I did not ask her what month or what year exactly, though I was calculating backwards in my head, trying to place when this might have occurred. I simply noted the information and thanked her for telling me. I did not tell her that I thought I knew what that attorney had been doing in my father's house. I did not tell her that an attorney does not visit houses casually. I did not tell her that my chest was tight, like a belt being cinched. In February 2022, I called my father on a Monday evening. I had prepared for this conversation the way I prepared for important conversations, by writing down what I wanted to say, by deciding in advance what I would and would not accuse him of, by rehearsing the tone I would use so that my voice would sound concerned but not angry, observant but not accusatory. I told him, plainly and without accusation, that I had noticed some account activity that concerned me. I told him I thought Renata might be drawing from his checking account without discussion. I was very careful with my language. I did not accuse her of theft. I did not demand that he stop her. I did not say the word stealing. I simply reported what I had observed. I said I had seen transactions that I did not recognize, deposits that appeared to be going to accounts I could not identify. I said I thought he should be aware of the activity. He said he would look into it. He did not sound alarmed. He did not sound defensive, the way a man might sound if someone had just suggested that his wife was stealing from him. He did not sound surprised or shocked. He sounded like a man who already knew what I was talking about, who had perhaps already had a conversation about it with Renata, who was confirming something he already understood. He sounded like a man who had already made a decision about what he was going to do in response to my concern. He said, "I'll talk to her. Don't worry about it." Don't worry about it. As if my concern was the problem, rather than the account activity I had observed. As if by raising the issue, I was creating an inconvenience that he would now have to manage. As if the proper response to a daughter noticing suspicious account activity was not to investigate or to protect the accounts, but to silence the daughter's concern. 11 days later, on March 4th, 2022, a revised will was executed at Beale and Associates. I did not know this at the time. I would not know it for months. Not until the estate reading. Not until I placed my own copy on Arthur Beale's desk. But the timing, when I eventually understood it, would be precise. 11 days between me telling my father about the account activity and a revised will being signed. 11 days between my raising a concern about Renata's access to his money and his apparently deciding that the solution was to change his legal documents in a way that benefited the person I was concerned about. 11 days. In that gap, something had shifted. In that gap, Renata had apparently convinced my father that the proper response to his daughter's concern about account access was to revise his will so that she, Renata, would receive the house and the bulk of his assets, so that if anything happened to him, she would control everything, so that my concern would become irrelevant. In April 2022, I called my father on a Tuesday evening. I had thought carefully about when to make this call. I wanted to catch him at a time when Renata would not be present, when he could speak freely, when he would not have to manage his words around her. I waited until 7 p.m. Knowing that Renata often went to her store on Tuesday evenings to manage inventory. I asked him directly whether his documents were still the same as before. I was very specific in my language. Are your documents still the same as before? Dad, the will and everything. I was giving him an opportunity to tell me the truth. I was giving him a chance to say, actually, Renata and I made some changes. We decided to revise some things. I was providing him with an out, a way to tell me that he had signed a revised will without it feeling like a shock or a betrayal. He said yes. He said his documents were the same as before. He said it without hesitation and without a pause. He said it in the kind of voice you use when you are stating something you believe to be true, or when you have decided that it is necessary to say something, and you have decided to commit to that lie completely, to deliver it with such certainty that no one could question it. I noted the time, 7:41 p.m. I was in my apartment, standing in my kitchen with my hand on the granite counter, and my father was on the other end of the phone in his house, in the house that Renata now called my house, and he was lying to me. I did not argue. I did not press. I did not say, I don't believe you. I simply said, okay, I was glad to hear that. I said I would talk to him soon. I hung up the phone. I stood in my kitchen for a moment without moving. Then I walked to my bedroom. I opened the drawer where I kept my planner. The physical planner, the paper one, where I recorded appointments and deadlines and the facts of my life. I found the page for April 2022. I found an empty line. I wrote the date at the top. I wrote the time, 7:41 p.m. Below that, in the margin, I wrote 2 words in careful letters. He lied, not in anger, not in the moment of emotional realization or betrayal. I simply wrote it the way I wrote everything, as a fact to be recorded. The way I recorded facts in my work at Meridian Estate Partners. The way I recorded things that mattered. The way a woman who works in estate law records things. Knowing that documents and dates and times are what separate what was believed from what was proved. I could not prove that he had lied. Not yet. I had suspicion. I had timing. I had a pattern of small inconsistencies that added up to a story, but not to evidence. I knew the difference. I worked with that difference every day. I worked with the precise distance between what a person suspected and what a person could prove in a court of law. I worked in that gap. I knew its dimensions, its weight, its particular gravity. I knew how long cases took when you had suspicion but no proof. I knew how much they cost. I knew how often the person with documentation won and the person with only memory and intuition lost. But I also knew what the gap meant. I knew that when a man paused before saying his documents were unchanged, he was usually telling a lie. I knew that when an attorney visited a house, something was being created. I knew that when 11 days separated a daughter's concern from a revised will, the revised will was probably addressing that concern, probably removing the daughter entirely from the will that had protected her. I knew that when a woman called a house my house, she was claiming it. I knew that when a man said, "Don't worry about it," in response to a concern about account access, he was not going to protect the accounts. These things all pointed in one direction. I could not prove it yet, but I knew what I suspected, and I knew that I was no longer hoping to be wrong. My father died of cardiac arrest in his sleep on May 17th, 2023. Renata called me at 6:14 in the morning. I know the time because my phone lit up before my alarm, and I reached for it in the dark of my bedroom and saw her name and the hour both on the screen simultaneously. I answered. She told me, in a voice that was composed and efficient, that he had passed peacefully in the night. She said the arrangements were being handled. She said I would receive notice of the estate reading. She said it the way you might tell someone that a package had been delayed or that a reservation had been changed. The information was conveyed. The call ended. I set my phone on the nightstand. I sat on the edge of my bed in the dark. I did not cry. I did not feel the particular shock or devastations that I had been taught to expect from the death of a parent. Instead, I felt something closer to recognition. I felt the sensation of a door I had been watching for years finally, conclusively closing. I felt the completion of something that had been suspended. My father's life, his choices, his ability to change his mind or revise his documents or move money around or sign anything else. All of it was finished now. The person I had spent 41 years trying to reach, trying to understand, trying to earn something from. That person was no longer able to reach back or withhold or decide anything ever again. I sat in that darkness for several minutes without moving. Then I called Luz Reyes. She picked up on the third ring, her voice still soft with sleep. I said, "My father died last night. I need you available in 2 weeks. She said she would clear her schedule. She asked if I was okay. I said I was fine. I said I would call her later with details. I hung up. I went to my kitchen. I retrieved the fireproof box from under my bed. The box I had placed there in September 2020. The box that had been waiting in the darkness for 3 years. I carried it to my kitchen table. I set it down in the center of the table. I did not open it. I did not need to open it. I already knew what was inside. 9 pages. The notarized copy of my father's original will, dated August 14th, 2019. The will that named me as his primary beneficiary. The will that had been signed before Renata moved in. The will that represented what my father had intended when I was still the person he had planned to include in the life he built. I made coffee. I used my good coffee. The kind I buy from a local roaster. The kind that costs more than the grocery store brand, but that tastes like something actual, like beans that were grown somewhere and roasted with intention. I made it carefully, measuring the grounds, using water that was exactly the right temperature, pouring it slowly. The kitchen filled with the smell of coffee. The morning light began to break through the windows, turning the darkness into something less absolute. I sat at my kitchen table with the fireproof box in front of me. I did not open it. I simply sat with it for 40 minutes, drinking my coffee, watching the light change, understanding that everything I had prepared for was now in motion. My father was dead. Renata would attempt to claim his estate, and I had the original will. I had the documentation. I had spent 3 years knowing that the moment would come when this box would matter, and now the moment had arrived. The evening before the estate reading, I laid out what I would bring to Beale and Associates. I arranged it on my bed. The folder containing the notarized copy of my father's will, my state-issued identification, a fresh legal pad, one pen. I did not rehearse what I would say. I had decided, in the months leading up to this, that I would say nothing until Arthur Beale finished reading every word of whatever document was in front of him. I would not interrupt. I would not explain. I would not justify or defend. I would simply wait until the revised will had been read in its entirety, until Renata believed she had won, until the moment when the certainty was complete. Then I would place the original on the desk. I folded these items into a folder. I set the folder on my nightstand. I lay in bed and did not sleep. Or I slept and did not remember sleeping. The night passed. Morning came. I drove to Beale & Associates in downtown Columbus. The office building was glass and steel, the kind of modern professional space where attorneys practiced estate law and handled the estates of people like my father. I arrived 11 minutes early. I parked in the garage and took the elevator to the 4th floor. The office was quiet. Only the receptionist was at her desk, coffee in hand, scrolling through something on her computer. She looked up when I arrived and said good morning, and I said good morning back. I was directed to the conference room. It was a room I had never seen before, but it looked like every other conference room in every other law office. There was a long table made of dark wood, surrounded by chairs upholstered in a neutral grey fabric. There was a window that looked out onto the street 4 stories below. There was a credenza along one wall with a coffee maker and glasses and a water pitcher. The lighting was fluorescent and slightly cold. I set my folder on the table in a place where it would be visible. I did not hide it. I did not place it under the table or in a bag or anywhere that suggested I was trying to conceal it. I simply put it in the middle of the table, in plain view, and then I pulled out a chair and sat down. I folded my hands on top of the folder. I waited. Arthur Beale arrived first, carrying a document in a manila envelope. He set it on the table in front of where he would sit. He nodded to me, but he said, "Good morning." I said good morning back. He went to get coffee. I continued to sit with my hands folded on top of my folder. Renata arrived at 9:02 a.m. She was wearing a navy blazer and a white blouse. Her hair was done. She had prepared for this meeting with the same care she prepared for everything else, with the assumption that how she looked mattered, that her presentation was part of her strategy. She glanced at the folder on the table in front of me. She did not ask what it was. She simply took a seat across from me, at the opposite end of the table. Luz arrived at 9:04. She looked at me across the table, and I saw her take in the folder, the way I was sitting, the particular stillness with which I was composed. She knew something was about to happen. She had known for 2 weeks that I had something, because I had told her, but she did not know what form it would take or exactly how it would unfold. She sat down next to me and placed her own bag on the floor. At 9:06, Arthur Beale returned with his coffee and took his seat at the head of the table. He opened the envelope. He removed several pages. He adjusted his glasses. He said good morning to all of us. He said he was there to read the will of Theodore Harmon, deceased May 17th, 2023. He said the will had been executed in March of 2022. He said he would read it in its entirety, and then we would discuss any questions. I sat very still. My hands remained folded on top of my folder. I did not look at Renata. I looked at Arthur Beale, at the pages in his hand, at the particular moment when he was about to read the words that would attempt to erase me from my father's estate. He began to read. Arthur Beale adjusted his glasses and began to read. His voice was measured and official, the practiced tone of someone who had read hundreds of wills to hundreds of families. He read the date, March 4th, 2022. He read the preamble. He read the provisions. He read my name where it did not appear as a beneficiary. He read the name of Renata Kowalski-Harmon where it appeared as the primary recipient of the estate. He read the language that transferred 47 Fairview Drive to her. He read the language that transferred the investment accounts, totaling approximately $340,000, to her. He read the language that made clear that I was not included in what my father had decided to do with the assets he had accumulated over a lifetime. Renata sat across from me with the particular stillness of a woman who believed the outcome was already decided. She did not move. She did not smile. She simply sat with her hands folded on the table in front of her, the picture of composed certainty. She had won. The will had been read. I had been disinherited. There was nothing left to do except the procedural closing of the meeting, the acknowledgement that this was the final word on how my father's life would be distributed now that he was gone. Beale turned the final page. He said, "That concludes the reading of the will executed March 4th, 2022. He set the pages down on the table in front of him. There was a pause, the brief, institutional silence that follows the reading of a document when no one in the room is prepared to immediately challenge it. It was the silence of acceptance, the silence of a done deal. I opened the folder. I did not speak. I did not explain. I simply opened the folder and removed the first page of the notarized copy of my father's original will. Dated August 14th, 2019. I held it for a moment so that everyone could see it was a document, that it had official markings, that it was not something I had hastily created. Then I placed it face up on the table, directly in front of Arthur Beale. I removed the second page. I placed it next to the first, then the third, the fourth, the fifth. I placed each page deliberately, in sequence, so that the will was assembling itself on the table in front of Beale like evidence being presented, like the truth being constructed one page at a time. The room was absolutely silent. I could hear the slight whisper of paper against paper as I removed each page from the folder. I could hear the small sound of each page being placed on the wood of the table. 6th page, 7th page, 8th page, 9th page. I placed my hands back in my lap. I waited until all 9 pages were face up in front of Arthur Beale, in order, the complete document visible. Only then did I speak. The document in front of you is a notarized copy of a will executed August 14th, 2019, I said. My voice was calm and precise, the voice of someone stating a fact rather than making an accusation. Signed by Theodore Harmon in the presence of 2 witnesses? It names me as primary beneficiary of 53% of the estate. The house, 47 Fairview Drive, passes to my personal estate. The investment accounts are divided between his surviving spouse and myself. I have the notarization date. I have the notary's commission number. I have all 9 pages, certified as true and accurate copies of the original document. I'd like you to compare the signatures. Renata's attorney, a man whose name I had not bothered to learn, shifted in his chair. "This is highly irregular," he said. "We were not informed that there was a prior will." Lars responded before I could. "The prior will is the controlling document," she said. "The revised will executed 11 days after my client expressed concern about account access raises significant questions about undue influence." Arthur Beale did not respond to either of them. He was looking at the 9 pages in front of him. At the dates. At the language. At the signatures. He set down the revised will, the one he had just finished reading, the one that had disinherited me. And he picked up the first page of my copy. He adjusted his glasses. He began to read. That gesture, the revised document lowered. The older one raised was the reversal made visible before a single legal determination was reached. In that moment, before any court had ruled, before any argument had been fully made, the balance had shifted. The document in his hand was now the one that mattered. Everything else was secondary. Renata said, "This is impossible!" I did not look at her. I opened my legal pad. I wrote something on the first blank line. I did not write much. I simply made a note, the way I had made notes for 3 years, documenting what was happening. I did not look up. I did not speak. I waited. Arthur Beale finished reading the first page. He moved to the second. His eyes tracked across the language. His expression did not change, but his breathing had shifted slightly. He was reading more carefully now, reading with the attention of someone who understood that the document in his hand contradicted the document he had just read aloud to the room. He finished page 2. He moved to page 3. He continued reading. The room was silent, except for the sound of pages turning. Renata had gone very still. Her attorney was writing something on his own legal pad. His pen moving quickly, as if he was trying to document the moment when his strategy had become irrelevant. Luz sat next to me with her hands folded on the table. She was not writing. She was simply watching Arthur Beale's face as he read. She was watching the moment when a man understands that the situation he believed was simple has become complicated. Beale finished reading the 9 pages. He set them down. He removed his glasses. He looked at me directly for the first time since the will reading had begun. He said, "Oh, I need to examine these more carefully. I'd like to compare the signatures on both documents. I need better light." He excused himself from the room. He left the revised will on the table. He left the notarized copy in front of him. 9 pages, assembled in perfect order. I watched him go. I listened to his footsteps in the hallway. I waited. He returned 5 minutes later with his own reading glasses. A different pair, with a stronger prescription, and a second lamp, which he set up on the table next to where the documents lay. He positioned the lamp so that it shined directly on the pages. He sat down. He placed his new glasses on his face. He picked up the first page of the notarized copy. That was the moment I knew I had already won. He did not need better light because the document was unclear. He needed better light because he was preparing to examine something that would hold up in court. Something that would require scrutiny. Something that mattered. He was preparing to do the work that a responsible attorney does when he is confronted with evidence that changes everything. I had documented every word my father had written. I had preserved every signature. I had notarized every page. I had kept the copy in a fireproof box for 3 years. I had arrived at this meeting 11 minutes early and placed the folder on the table in full view. I had not spoken until all 9 pages were in front of him. I had stated the facts. I had provided the evidence. I had done everything an attorney would do to make a case that could not be contested. And now Arthur Beale was examining my work with the seriousness it deserved. Renata stood up. She said, "This is a mistake. Those pages could be anything. They could be doctored. They could be... They're notarized," I said. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. Rosa Delgado certified them on September 21st, 2020. You can verify her commission through the state bar. You can verify the date. You can verify that these are true and accurate copies of the original document. Renata opened her mouth. Her attorney put his hand on her arm. He shook his head slightly. She closed her mouth. Arthur Beale continued examining the documents. He was comparing signatures now, looking at my father's signature on the revised will, then looking at my father's signature on the original will. He was reading the language side by side. He was doing the work that would eventually lead him to tell Renata that her claim on the estate was not as straightforward as she had believed. Luz leaned over slightly and whispered, "You got him!" I did not respond. I simply sat with my hands folded on the table, watching Arthur Beale examine the evidence of 3 years of preparation, watching him understand what had happened, watching him realize that the woman who had sat across from him at this table with a manila folder in her lap had known exactly what she was doing the entire time. I had not raised my voice. I had not cried or pleaded or explained myself. I had simply placed 9 pages on a desk and stated facts. I had let the documentation do the work. I had let preparation speak louder than emotion. And it had worked exactly as I had planned it would work. The legal review took 7 weeks. Arthur Beale spent those weeks comparing signatures, examining the notarization, reviewing the timeline. He consulted with Renata's attorney. He examined the revised will for evidence of the particular pressure that one person can exert on another when they are managing access to money, and making themselves indispensable. He looked at the dates. He looked at the 11 days between my phone call expressing concern about account access and the execution of a revised will that removed me entirely from my father's estate. He looked at the pattern. On the 51st day, he called Luce and told her that he believed the 2019 will was the controlling document. He said the 2022 revision showed hallmarks of undue influence. The timing, the nature of the revision, the circumstances under which it had been executed. He said he would not recommend that Renata contest the matter further. Renata's attorney called Luce on the 8th day of the second week. Renata was not contesting. She would accept the determination that the original will stood. I would receive my share of the estate, $180,000 from the investment accounts. I would have the legal right to purchase Renata's interest in 47 Fairview Drive at independently appraised value. The house would be assessed. The price would be set. If I wanted to buy it, I could. If I did not, it would be sold, and the proceeds divided. I wanted to buy it! 3 weeks after the settlement was finalized, I walked through 47 Fairview Drive alone for the first time since my father died. The house was quiet, in a way it had not been quiet in years. Renata had moved out. She had taken her furniture, the pieces she had brought with her, the things she had accumulated in the years she had lived there. The rooms looked different without her presence. They looked smaller somehow, and also more empty. The living room had that particular quality of a space that had been stripped of the things that made it a home for someone. The kitchen was different too. The beet soup smell was gone. Instead, there was just the neutral smell of an empty house. The smell of nothing particular. The smell of a space waiting to become something again. I walked to the filing cabinet. It was still there, in the space where my father had left it, where I had found the will 3 years earlier. I opened the lower cabinet to the left of the sink. The same cabinet, the same drawer pull, the same interior divided into folders and binders, and the organized chaos of a man's papers. I stood in front of it without opening anything. I simply stood there and felt precisely the texture of the lesson I had not chosen, but had received. I understood, in that moment, what my mother had been telling me when I was 18 years old. I understood what she meant when she said that records would matter. I understood what she was preparing me for. Not for a specific threat, not for a specific betrayal, but for the knowledge that the people who loved you might fail you, and that the only thing that would survive that failure was documentation. The only thing that could not be revised or rewritten or explained away was a notarized copy, placed carefully in a fireproof box, stored under a bed, retrieved when needed, placed on a desk, 1 page at a time. The dishwasher had been replaced. The old one, the one that had made the grinding noise, the sound that had started everything, was gone. In its place was a new machine, stainless steel, silent. Renata must have had it installed in those weeks after my father died. Before the legal challenges began. She must have decided that if she was going to live in this house, she would not live with the broken things. She would fix them. She would make it her own. She would erase the previous owner's choices and replace them with her own. But she could not erase the filing cabinet. She could not reach back 3 years and unsign the will my father had signed in 2019. She could not revise the notarization. She could not make the original disappear simply because she had drafted a new version. That evening, I called my mother. She picked up on the second ring. I said hello. She said hello back. I said, I want to read you something. I opened my legal pad to the page where I had written the sentence I had said at the table during the estate reading. The moment when I had placed the 9th page in front of Arthur Beale, I read, "The document in front of you is a notarized copy of a will executed August 14th, 2019. My mother laughed. It was a short, full laugh that held no surprise whatsoever. Only recognition. Only the sound of someone who had always known how this would end, who had planted the seed 18 years earlier and had simply waited to see it grow into exactly the thing she had predicted. She said, "Good girl." She said, "I'm proud of you." She said, "Tell me everything." I told her. I told her about the fireproof box. I told her about the notary fee. I told her about the filing cabinet and the 9 pages and the way Arthur Beale's face had changed when he understood what I was holding. I told her about the 11 days between my phone call and the revised will. I told her about Renata standing up and saying it was impossible. I told her about my mother being right, all those years ago, about the power of keeping records. She listened. When I finished, she said, "Your father loved you. I know he did, but he was not good at showing it. He was not good at choosing you when choosing you was difficult. That was his failure, not yours." I said I knew that. She said, "So you protected yourself, you documented, you prepared. And when the moment came, you had the evidence. That's what love looks like sometimes. It looks like a woman keeping records when no one has told her that she will need them." I hung up the phone and sat in my apartment. The apartment I had rented for 6 years on my salary of $51,200 a year. The apartment that had never been my father's responsibility. The apartment that was entirely and completely my own. And I understood what she meant. Love without documentation is a feeling. Feelings can be revised. Feelings can be explained away or reinterpreted or forgotten. A man can love his daughter and still sign a new will that removes her from his estate. He can say one thing and mean it, and then say another thing and mean that instead he can change his mind. He can be changed by someone else. Feelings are not stable. Feelings shift. What cannot be revised is a notarized copy. What cannot be explained away is a document dated August 14th, 2019 with my father's signature and 2 witnesses and a notary's seal. What cannot be forgotten is 9 pages stored in a fireproof box under a bed for 3 years. Retrieved on a Tuesday morning, carried into a conference room, and placed on a desk, 1 page at a time in front of everyone who had assumed I had nothing. Not money, not leverage, not power. Just 9 pages. Just documentation. Just the thing my mother had told me to keep when I was young and did not yet understand that someday I would need it. I purchased the house. I paid the appraised value for Renata's interest. I transferred the deed into my name. I replaced the dishwasher with a better one. I painted the walls. I made the house my own. Not because I wanted to erase Renata's presence. I did not care enough about her presence to erase it. But because the house was finally mine, in a way it had never been before. It was not my father's house that I was visiting. It was not a space I had to manage to earn the right to occupy. It was a place where I had lived and suffered and learned. And now it belonged to me entirely. My mother was right. At 18 years old, sitting across the kitchen table from her, eating a meal she had prepared with the precision she applied to everything, I was receiving a lesson about the future. I was being taught to keep records. I was being trained in the quiet power of documentation. I was being prepared for a moment I could not yet imagine. A moment when the person I loved would fail me, and the only thing that would stand between me and erasure would be the evidence I had kept. I did not know who I would be keeping them from. I did not know it would be my father. I did not know it would be Renata. I did not know it would be the particular combination of a man's weakness and a woman's entitlement and a daughter's refusal to disappear. But my mother knew the shape of these things. She knew that love was not always reliable. She knew that the only thing you could truly depend on was documentation. She knew that a woman who kept records, who filed things in order, who verified signatures, who understood the difference between suspicion and evidence, would never be helpless. She would never be erased. She would never be rewritten into a story that did not include her. I kept the records. When the moment came, I had the evidence, and when I placed those 9 pages on the desk, one at a time, in front of a room full of people who had underestimated me, I was not doing it for vindication. I was not doing it for justice, though justice is what followed. I was doing it because it was what my mother had taught me to do. I was doing it because documentation was the only weapon I had ever needed.